Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. There was a strong sense of hope among the massive crowd outside the Louvre where Emmanuel Macron spoke on Sunday night after his landslide victory over right-wing nationalist Marine Le Pen in the French presidential election. The 39-year-old centrist's amalgam of positions holds the potential for radically reshaping the angry, polarized, stalled politics of troubled democracies like the US, Britain and France. In addition, he represents a rejection of the anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-globalization populism that has made its way across the globe. Macron wants to strengthen the European Union and free trade and implicitly restore France as a counterweight to Germany. He calls for an inclusive society that embraces France's huge Muslim population and welcomes immigrants and refugees. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze what Macron's win means for the future of France, Europe and the world. Joining me on the program today are Abhaya Srivastava, Special Correspondent, AFP, Pramit Chaudhuri, Foreign Editor, Hindustan Times, Suresh K. Goel, former diplomat, and Gulshan Sachdeva, Professor, School of International Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program. Abhaya, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What does this win for Macron mean for France?
It is kind of restores the faith of people in a leader who's seen as business friendly. He's promised to, rid the country of this massive unemployment. So really, people are looking forward to him. They have a lot of hopes from this young leader. Mind you, he's the youngest president. At 39, he's the youngest president ever. So that way, there's so many hopes that he will pull France out of this abyss, that people had started losing hope. So now they have a new future to look forward to.
Okay, fair enough. Pramit Chaudhuri, as far as Europe is concerned, what does Europe look forward to now after Macron's win?
Well, Europe as a whole will be relieved. If Le Pen had won, that would have effectively meant the end of the European Union because, as she had said herself, the first thing I will do as President of France is to call for a referendum on the euro or leave the euro and then hold a referendum on European Union membership. This is now, and without France, the European Union would have effectively been finished as an organization. So they have at least got a reprieve on this front. France, the European Union still stands. The concept of European unity remains. And the status quo, broadly speaking, as far as Europe is concerned, is now reaffirmed. We saw effectively the anti-immigrant political wave first lose in Austria on the presidential elections, then it lost again in Netherlands with the defeat of Geert Wilders. And now with France, we assume that that is now an ebb tide in European politics. However, the challenge, which I'm sure we'll discuss, is the fact that Macron does not have an assembly, does not have a legislative party in existence. And next month, the National Assembly of France goes to the polls. And it's going to be interesting to see whether he can get together a sufficiently large number of assembly votes to run a government. Because he is a new party. It has very little in this way of grassroots structure. And Le Pen is clearly counting that he will not be able to function as a president over the next 5 years.
Sure. Professor, I'd like to come to you now and take the point that Pramit Chaudhuri is making forward. The first hurdle has been crossed as far as the presidential election is concerned, but June is going to be extremely crucial for Macron because there's a parliamentary election and he has to cobble up a majority of sorts so as to ensure that he can go on from there on smoothly, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the way he has managed so far and, with his charisma, with his leadership, one can only hope that, he'll be able to, he may not be able to win majority, but I'm sure he'll be able to get significant numbers and then he can have to, he have to work certain kind of coalition with the left and right and with everybody else. There the real test, of course, will come because his major economic policies are going to be very pro-European, pro-market, pro-globalization, which some of the left parties within France will have certain problems. But I think one can only hope that he'll be able to manage when you have, but of course these are challenges. Indeed. But so far I think it has been quite remarkable because he was not an established kind of political player, doesn't come from any political party, and the kind of Euroscepticism you see in Europe in the last few years with all kind of crises, from Euro crisis to Greek crisis to refugee crisis and all other kind of crises which Europe is facing, getting elected, and he was the most pro-European kind of candidate among all candidates. So this is, I think, quite remarkable. And I think French voters have also have been quite mature. I mean, they haven't voted. I mean, there was a lot of security threats. There were a lot of, terrorist attacks happened in recent past. But still, they didn't vote out of fear. All kind of, those sentiments were there. But I think this has been kind of a good news for France, as well as also good news for the Europe and for the European Union, because, there was real threat to the, as Pramit has mentioned, to the European security and economic architecture. And the way things were happening, I think it happened in UK and happened in US, and they were quite optimistic that things can happen in France as well.
Sure.
But I think they will be relieved both in France as well as in Europe.
Ambassador, do you see Macron keeping the European Union together? Do you see that happening under Macron?
Very, very difficult to say really at this stage, because there is certainly a wave of kind of, anti-Europeanism. It is not as strong at the moment. Clearly, the elections in France suggest that there is still a focus on one Europeanism really. But the way it is happening, you don't know what actually might be the picture after 1 year. And in any case, the elections for the parliament in the month of June would indicate where it is going. I think basically, for the time being, I would look at the election of Macron also as a response to Brexit. In a sense, France and UK have traditionally been rivals for influence, and to the extent that France doesn't even consider UK sufficiently European really in that sense. So when UK said Brexit, so it's a response to UK that, look, you may want to go, but Europe will remain. It will make the task of Theresa May more difficult for the time being. But if Brexit does take place, I think that is the time, 2 years down the line, if once Brexit has taken place, to see where the European structures go from there. It's too early to say really.
Fair enough. Abhaya, as far as this whole presidency is concerned, we saw Marine Le Pen and Macron, go through this bitter presidential debate, and it has been ugly, the presidential race. And it is what Marine Le Pen has managed to do is she has left this very strong nationalist, kind of ideology and belief behind. How is Macron now going to deal with that sentiment?
I think he'll have to woo the moderates in both the right parties as well as the left parties. He needs their support. If he has to win the legislative elections, he has to woo the moderates in both the parties. And he has to tell them, look, we have an alternative. We don't want to go the extremism path. We can give you the alternative. We are for sensible economic pro-reform policies. I want to take France with me. We are all together in it. So I think he can appeal to, the entire France at sea. Here is a person who's rational, who's looking at the future in a sense that the divided France is no longer, kind of a nightmare, because so many young voters were thinking that, imagine if Brexit happens, what will happen to us? So in that sense, I think it's very, very important for him to take the whole of the country with him.
But his policy is on a knife's edge, isn't it, Pramit? I mean, it's just one terror attack or one war, or for that matter, just a major economic collapse away from everything crumbling and coming down.
Well, let's put it this way. The Macron represents a consensus within France that included even Hollande, the socialist, as well as François Fillon and Alain Juppé, the two right-wing candidates, that France needs very stringent structural economic reforms. France has been losing competitiveness in the economy now for the past decade. And what basically Gerhard Schröder had done in Germany earlier, Macron or somebody needed to do in France. Le Pen's solution, of course, was essentially for France to withdraw from the European Union and from the larger global economy. But Macron needs to be able to pass legislation to accomplish this. Now, I would suspect that Marine Le Pen's calculation is that in the French National Assembly, her vote base of roughly a third of the voters is stable. That doesn't go anywhere else. So she is going to be able to hold on to maybe a quarter to 30% of the assembly elections, leaving roughly 60 to 70% to be divided between Macron, the socialists, as well as the Republican Party of France, which is the right-wing party. If they equally share it among themselves, in that case, Macron has barely 20% of the seats in the assembly. And he does not have the grassroots structure that the other two established parties have. So can Macron act like, let's say, Narendra Modi? Can he use his personal charisma to go beyond his own party's drawbacks and sweep that? And that's going to be much more difficult because obviously when you vote at the legislative level, you're essentially voting at a local, for a local parliamentarian, a local legislator, rather than for Macron himself. And that's going to be a huge challenge. And he has only 1 month to do this. But if he fails to do this, if he fails to get a functional government, he will then have a strange game of having, because he combines, if you wish, socialist cultural values with right-wing economic reform policies. And he's going to have to cobble together a coalition, as has been mentioned, of probably largely people from the Republican side and some reform-minded socialists to get his legislation through on the economic front. But not having a mandate makes it extraordinarily difficult to carry out economic reforms. Those are the most painful reforms to carry out. And he's going to have Le Pen sitting there with roughly a quarter to a third of the seats in the assembly, basically trying to ensure that he does not succeed as a government, as the head of France, on the reform front or on anything else. And as you've mentioned, the wild card is terrorism. France has now been the worst victim of terrorism in Europe now in the past 3 or 4 years. Over 230 Frenchmen have died in terrorist attacks on France. And when I've talked to French government officials, they're expecting more to come for 2 reasons. One, the Islamic State is collapsing, and roughly 5,000 to 10,000 foreign fighters, mostly Europeans, are heading back to Europe. And will do so over the next 6 to 8 months. Second, the ability of European police to intercept terrorist groups in Europe has fallen from 50% down to 30%. They're only catching 1 out of every 3 attacks before it happens. Right. So they're expecting a very bloody next 1 to 2 years in France and elsewhere on the terrorism front.
Sure. You know, Professor, that's one aspect, or that's one area where Marine Le Pen attacked Macron right through the presidential campaign as well. We saw that his policy has not been very clear as far as dealing or fighting terrorism is concerned. He said that he's going to speak to internet giants really and try and get them to divulge details. No real concrete plan as far as terrorism is concerned. Do you see that as a hindrance in the near future?
Well, I don't think so. Because yes, there is obviously a real challenge for him to manage later on politics. But I think for the country as a whole, managing Le Pen would have been much more difficult than managing this coalition politics. Now we are talking a kind of traditional coalition politics, which, I mean, France has not been that much kind of, used to this, but Europe has been. So I think, and France very much part of the European institutions. So I think the major challenge, of course, for him would be how to bring growth back to the French economy. Luckily, for the last 1 year or more than 1 year, French economy has been doing reasonably well compared to the last 3 years. Unemployment is still high, roughly about 10%, but still things are on the move. So he himself being an economist, if he is able to manage somehow new economic reforms and manage to do well certain things within the European Union and also work very closely with the Germans, because I think this election will also have certain impact even in the coming German elections.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Will it have any bearing as far as the German
elections? It will happen, because there will be certain positive thing happening for Angela Merkel as well coming from this election. So coming back of Franco-German alliance to the European Union, I think this will bring back some kind of dynamism within the Europe, because he being very pro-European and also very close to some extent closer to the German policies of austerity and others, which other socialists were relatively less inclined to. So I think in that sense, I mean, he has to work very hard, but I think still he'll be able to manage. Now, as far as the terrorist attacks and anything can happen, obviously all the right-wing parties would like to use them, and one cannot underestimate their power as well.
Sure.
Because they still have about 37-36% vote, and they will continue to have. But still, I think at the moment, the kind of conditions in which Europe was and France was, this is the best which could have happened to them. Of course,
Sure.
there are huge challenges.
Sure. Ambassador, right-wing populism has been on the rise over the last few years across the world and more so in Europe. Were you surprised at all that, France bucked the trend, if we could call it that?
Well, surprised, yes, but I think right from the beginning in the elections, while there was a rise in the right-wing sentiments in France, those who know the French politics very well, they were a bit skeptical even at that time that Marine Le Pen will be able to cobble up the kind of number of votes which are required for her to win the elections.
The same was said about Trump as well, but he ended up, winning. So there were
Yes.
several people who believed that Marine Le Pen could possibly take
Let
this
us not
away
talk
as well.
about exceptions
She
and
also believed
aberrations
that,
really from elsewhere.
Sure.
What happened in the USA was a very different kind of a thing. There, the economy of the USA and Trump's promises to the US nationals that he will be able to get more jobs for the white US, that carried weight really. Here, the election was fought not on the basis of economics primarily. It was basically focused on Europeanism, European nationalism, the European. So there was a bit of a difference in the election here. And I think on the whole, France, to the best of my understanding, remains very, very pro-European country. In that sense, what happened in the referendum in UK, that was an exception, not election of Macron.
Okay, sure. Let's take the discussion forward and see what this means really to India. Abhaya, as far as India is concerned, is it a good thing that Macron won? Clearly, it is much better than Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, of course, it's a good thing because India can now look forward to better relations with the EU. The relations with the EU had kind of stagnated over the years. So now, when Macron came onto the stage, the EU anthem was played, the Ode to Joy. So that shows that here is a guy who's going to be really pro-EU, and that in turn kind of spells kind of positive news for India as well, because then we can have better trade deals with the EU, we can negotiate. The whole bloc has become vibrant again as far as India is concerned, and we can really look forward to good deals. We can look forward to better terms with a bloc which has now been empowered again. Now that we have a person who's leading France, who's very pro-EU, he's made it very clear that he's going to really work to revitalize EU. So in that sense, India should be very, very happy.
Sure. Pramit, as far as Macron is concerned, his biggest strength probably is that he's an optimist. And he's probably one of only two world leaders today who's speaking about positive things, him being one and the other, of course, being Justin Trudeau.
Yes, well, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think he was able to sweep. But keep in mind, Macron, for all of his positive message and his peculiar en marche party that he sort of dug out of created in just a few months' time, and this entire charisma thing that he's built around himself. Ultimately, though, he was also accidentally victorious. I mean, Francois Fillon was almost certain to have won the election if Fillon hadn't been caught in a series of corruption scandals. I would have expected Fillon to have been the president. And even before Fillon, you had Juppé, who was considered by everybody else to be, at least outside of France, to be the best candidate France had. And Juppé was surprisingly defeated by Fillon in the primaries in his own party. So to some degree, Macron has had a series of remarkable circumstances that have allowed him to come to the space that he is, and everybody hopes that will continue, especially into the National Assembly elections. Because his policies, as I said, actually represent a consensus, I would argue, within the French establishment, at least as far as both the European Union is concerned, as well as what France needs to do on the economic front. So yes, his charisma is what has helped him to create an independent party, but he's had a remarkable run of luck to get to the place that he is right now.
Professor, are the expectations now for him to deliver sky high?
Not really. I mean, I don't think people are really expecting. They are just relieved that Le Pen is not there, most of them. And so, yes, I mean, there is obviously some kind of expectation.
So would you call it a vote against Le Pen then?
To some extent,
Yeah,
yes. To large extent, that's also okay. Because otherwise, I don't think many of the leftist parties would have voted for a candidate like him. Because, I mean, they were very clear. I mean, that's what I was saying. There is also a message for many other countries where you have rise of populism. So you really need some kind of new leaders with new faces, with no really, kind of baggage of right or left or something. Then only you can perhaps counter, because people are really fed up with the traditional political parties as well as from the traditional leaders. So in that sense, this is also a kind of a new kind of politics one can see emerging, not just in France, but also perhaps in other countries in Europe as well. And you're asking about India, its impact on that. No, broadly there's no direct bearing on us, but at the same time, Europe being still our very important trade and economic partner. So any kind of disruption in Europe is not really in our favor. So in that sense, some kind of stability within Eurozone, within the EU, in the long run or even the medium run is actually useful for us. But of course, even if there would have been another candidate, winning the elections, would have continued, because still, I mean, France is a very close strategic partner of India. But yes, it's actually it's a reasonably better thing for us to have a person like him in France and in Europe.
Sure. Ambassador, would you like to add something on India and French relations going forward?
Absolutely. I think we need to look at the impact of Macron's election on India-France relations bilaterally, not through so much of EU prism really. More than 3 or 4 years ago, we began to shift our structure of relationship from EU to bilaterals really, as you know. And we know which are the most important relationships as far as India is concerned in Europe, and France is one of them in terms of both defense, economic and trade, culture, you name it. Yes, Europe is an important link, but I think our bilateral component is far more important for us than his role as the European leader really. Now, coming to the bilaterals, really speaking, he is a new leader. We don't really know so much about him as to what his policies are going to be. Marine Le Pen was known earlier, and we were fairly confident that she would be a good friend of India because of what she stands for. But I'm sure that eventually in a relationship, when the realities sink in, he is going to be equally important or equally good for India relations with France. Yes.
Sure. I've got time now to get quick closing comments from all my guests, beginning with you, Abhaya. As far as the French people itself are concerned, a victory for them?
Of course, it's a victory for them, because here is a business-friendly, young, energetic, as you said, like the Canadian Prime Minister. So here is somebody who brings with him a lot of hope, optimism, because Marine Le Pen, she stood for negativity, closed policies, protectionism, building walls, all the negative things that you could associate. So here is a person who represents just the opposite. So I think it's a victory for the French people, and we should all kind of rejoice.
Pramit, where does Macron's biggest challenge lie?
Passing legislation. He has to pass legislation and fulfill the economic mandate, because if he does not get the economy of France competitive for the next 10 to 15 years, then Le Pen is waiting in the wings, because the real accomplishment that she has done is that she is now the main opposition party in France. And so she still remains the alternative 5 years from now, and that's something Macron has to be able to stop.
Sure. Professor, your closing remarks on the program.
Well, I think as I said, during this elections, a lot of things were at stake for France as well as for Europe. And I think this will be a new trend in Europe after this, because there were, after a lot of negative news coming from Europe, now they'll be reassured that things are beginning to, fall in place, at least for Europe. And I think for the next few years, one could see more Franco-German kind of push for certain kind of integration project within Europe. And I think the negative things which are, and of course there will also be tough negotiation with the UK, because he's also going to be more toward the European project rather than moving out from Europe. But I think for India it's useful, because Le Pen, whatever she might have said, she would have created problems in Europe. She would have also been more protectionist. He would have been more open economy kind of person.
Ambassador, your close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
As far as that is concerned, I'm not going to go about the India route once again, because we need to see how he does and what his policies are in future. But I think the biggest challenge for Macron in the future is going to be really the shape of a new Europe. France and Germany both depend economically on linkages with Europe for their own growth. And a Europe without UK, a Europe which is going basically more right-wing, where there is more protectionism, is not in the interest of both either France or Germany. And also, therefore, the alliances which are going to change, come about, and how the Europe is going to behave in future will be probably the biggest challenge for him.
Sure, it remains to be seen what happens, but one thing is for sure, Macron's presidency is going to be a tough one. And, the toughest test, of course, is going to come in June. That's all the time we have on this edition of The Big Picture. Abhaya Srivastava, Suresh K. Goel, Gulshan Sachdeva, and Pramit Chaudhuri. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have. See you again next time.